Last week, Joe Biden commuted the sentences of nearly 1,500 convicted criminals, including drug dealers, fraudsters, and corrupt public officials. These are not sympathetic figures. These are individuals who stole from the poor and poisoned the sick. They tore families apart and menaced communities. They were sent to jail. They belong in jail. With this action, Joe Biden didn't just reward 1,500 criminals, he robbed hundreds of thousands of victims of the closure and justice they deserve. The cruelty of these commutations is only matched by the shameless incompetence of the administration that issued them. This administration admitted that Joe Biden didn't individually review these cases, or for that matter, anyone else individually reviewed the cases. Yet he nullified the verdict of thousands of jurors and judges anyway. He also disrespected the countless man-hours that federal law enforcement and prosecutors dedicated to solving these cases. The whole purpose of the presidential pardon power is to correct individual and limited failures of the criminal justice system. It's in the nature of the power in government itself. We are a legislature. We make generally applicable, prospective laws for everyone. Can those laws, in certain cases, yield unjust outcomes? Yes, of course. That is the nature of the legislative power. The reason an executive has the pardon power is to mitigate that injustice in specific, particular cases. It's not to make generally applicable pardons in a broad set of parameters, as White House officials have caused it. Certainly not to blindly free hundreds of duly convicted criminals. These blanket commutations demonstrate a gross contempt for our legal system and its traditions. To put President Biden's actions in context, he issued more commutations in a single day than Donald Trump, George Bush, and Bill Clinton issued in their entire presidencies. Combined. Let's just talk about a few of the beneficiaries of Joe Biden's jailbreak. Jacqueline Mills stole $3 million that was intended for hungry Arkansas kids and low-income families. Dr. Mira Sachdeva defrauded Medicare by diluting chemotherapy drugs and reusing old needles on cancer patients. At least one patient, contracted HIV as a result. Fraudster Paul Burks ran a nearly $1 billion Ponzi scheme that robbed 900,000 investors of their money. Drug dealer Wendy Hechtman and her husband manufactured and distributed super deadly carfentanil, unleashing an epidemic of drug overdoses in Omaha. Another drug dealer, Daniel Fillerup, killed a 31-year-old relapsing addict by selling her fentanyl, which is 50 times stronger than the heroin she thought she was buying. Shuquan Hemingway trafficked heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamine, and guns for the vicious Jalisco New Generation cartel. Joe Biden even commuted the sentence of a serial killer, Virginia Gray, who is known as the Black Widow, for murdering 2 husbands and a boyfriend and collecting insurance money. Perhaps the president would have reconsidered this decision if he knew anything about Mrs. Gray, but he didn't, because yet again, he and White House officials did not review individual cases on the merits. They didn't pick up the case file. They didn't talk to victims or families. Then there's the parade of corrupt public officials, the worst of whom is Michael Conahan, the so-called cash for kids judge, who accepted kickbacks in exchange for his role in sending more than 2,300 children to private detention centers including an 8-year-old. Again, a judge in Pennsylvania sentenced more than 2,300 children to private juvenile detention centers in return for cash kickbacks. One man he sent to jail later killed himself. He was just 23 years old. His mother said that she is shocked and hurt by Joe Biden's commutation. Yet again, the president did not review the case individually. President Biden also commuted the sentence of an Ohio commissioner who took $450,000 in bribes. He even commuted the sentence of Rita Crunwell, a city comptroller from Illinois who embezzled $54 million. Crunwell was responsible for not only the biggest city embezzlement scandal in the history of Illinois, she was responsible for the biggest municipal embezzlement scandal in the history of America up to that time. Now, I understand that we have disagreements about criminal justice, and the Democrats don't always share my view on these things. But for years, we've heard lectures about the rule of law and how Joe Biden and Democrats are the defenders of democracy. Yet Joe Biden is the one commuting the sentences of the very public officials who most threaten the public trust in our democracy. The American people also know that Joe Biden issued these commutations for a simple reason. It helps cover up the corrupt pardon that he issued to his corrupt son to protect his family. I think we should condemn all of these pardons and certainly condemn the president for not individually reviewing the merits of the cases. But again, I understand my Democratic colleagues don't agree with that, so I only offer a resolution to condemn one pardon. Simply one. Maybe the worst of them all, the commutation of Michael Conahan, the Cash for Kids judge who took cash kickbacks and bribes to sentence more than 2,300 kids to private detention centers. The judge who put American children in jail for money. Surely the Senate can condemn this single act of corrupt clemency. Therefore, Mr. President, notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to consideration of Senate Resolution 935, which is at the desk. Further, I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Illinois.
reserving the right to object, I would like to clarify the record on President Biden's use of the pardon power, which is established in the Constitution in Article 2, Section 2. On December 12th, President Biden commuted the sentences of nearly 1,500 Americans who were placed on home confinement under a bipartisan provision of the CARES Act. These individuals were all convicted of non-violent offenses and have complied with the terms of home confinement for more than 1 year. This clemency is consistent with a long history of presidents using a categorical approach to exercise the constitutional power of pardon. Example, President Kennedy pardoned all first-time offenders convicted of violating the Narcotics Control Act of 1956. President Truman granted pardons to more than 1,500 men convicted of violating the Selective Service Act during their draft in World War II. President Carter provided a categorical pardon for hundreds of thousands of men who evaded the draft during the Vietnam War. Now, I understand that Senator Cotton is opposed to clemency in a particular individual's case. But if Senator Cotton is concerned about about undermining the rule of law and robbing victims of justice, we should consider just a few of President Donald Trump's pardons. For example, take President Trump's decision to grant clemency to at least 10 healthcare executives and doctors convicted on large-scale Medicare fraud schemes. These decisions wiped away years of prison sentences and restitution totaling hundreds of millions of dollars for some of the worst healthcare fraudsters in the history of the United States of America. Consider one, Philip S. Forbes, who had been sentenced to 20 years in prison for involving himself in the largest healthcare fraud scheme ever charged by the Department of Justice. S. Forbes received more than $37 million in a scheme involving $1.3 billion in fraudulent claims. Following his commutation from President Trump, Mr. S. Forbes pled guilty to new Medicaid fraud charges. In October, he was arrested for domestic violence. He was at least the 7th person pardoned by President Trump to be charged with a new crime. President Trump also used his pardon power to provide relief for his political loyalists, including his former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, his national security advisor, Michael Flynn, his former advisor, Steve Bannon, and at least 7 Republican congressmen who had been convicted of crime. Bannon was charged with defrauding donors of more than $1 million as part of a fundraising campaign purportedly aimed at supporting President Trump's border wall. Do you remember that? He ended up soliciting true loyalists and friends of Donald Trump, saying that he was going to raise money and build the wall that Donald Trump, as candidate, spoke of so frequently. Bannon actually used the money he raised to cover hundreds of thousands of dollars of his own personal expenses. President Trump has now promised that he will pardon the January 6th rioters on day one of his new administration. He calls them, quote, political prisoners. You remember January 6th, Mr. President. I'll bet the senator from Arkansas remembers it too. This insurrectionist mob beat down the doors of the Capitol, invaded this chamber, and took control of this building, to the shame of our country to allow that to happen. And then along comes President Trump, says, if I'm reelected, I'll pardon them. I'd like to ask my colleague from Arkansas if he supports pardoning the following individuals who were prosecuted for wrongdoing on January 6th. David Dempsey, convicted of assaulting police officers by using, quote, his hands, feet, flagpoles, crutches, pepper spray, broken pieces of furniture, and anything else he could get his hands on as weapons against the police. Or how about Shane Jenkins, who was convicted of using 2 tomahawk axes to break into this Capitol building and assaulting police officers by throwing a wooden desk drawer and a flagpole at them? How about a Trump pardon for Kyle Fitzsimmons? On January 6th, he was convicted of 5 separate assaults against law enforcement, including one that caused career-ending, life-altering injuries to U.S. Capitol Police Sergeant Aquino Ganell. And Kenneth Bonowitz, another perhaps beneficiary of a Trump pardon when he's sworn in as a president again. Mr. Bonowitz was a member of the so-called Proud Boys. He assaulted at least 6 officers, including placing one officer in a chokehold and lifting him up by the neck. Bonowitz injured one officer so severely, the officer was forced to retire from the police force. So if you want to talk about misuse of a presidential pardon power, let's be fair, honest, and balanced. I don't recall the senator from Arkansas or any single Republican colleague of his introducing similar resolutions to criticize any of President Trump's pardons. And I haven't heard any Senate Republican urging President-elect Trump not to pardon the January 6th rioters. President Biden's commutations directed at a group of individuals who've demonstrated a commitment to rehabilitation are far more defensible than President Trump's use of pardon power during his first term and what he's planning for the beginning, the very first day, the day of his dictatorial rule, as he called it, on the beginning of his second term. For these reasons, I object.
Senator from Arkansas.
Heard a lot of very troubling cases from the senator from Illinois. And it's true, I generally think presidents have given out improvidential pardons over times, and I'm not going to defend many of those cases of pardons. For instance, I'm not going to defend Jimmy Carter pardoning a bunch of draft dodgers indiscriminately, mostly rich and privileged kids who didn't do their duty, when poor kids from places like Yale County, Arkansas, or South Little Rock were doing their duty in Vietnam like my father was. But we're not here to talk about Vietnam draft dodgers, or who President Trump pardoned, or who he might pardon. There is a resolution pending on the floor that specifically condemns Michael Conahan, the cash for kids judge, who took cash kickbacks to sentence children to private juvenile detention center. Some words about this judge. I do feel strongly that President Biden got it absolutely wrong and created a lot of pain. Some children took their lives because of this. Frankly, I thought the sentence that the judge got was too light. He deserved to be behind bars, not walking as a free man. Strong words, not my words. Those are the words of Pennsylvania's Democratic governor, Josh Shapiro, who again called Joe Biden's clemency decision absolutely wrong. The senior senator from Minnesota joined Governor Shapiro and said that she too disagreed with the president's decision. She said that she, quote, did not like that one. Even the chairman of the West Virginia Democratic Party publicly condemned President Biden's commutations and specifically singled out the commutation of Judge Conahan, the cash for kids judge. This resolution is not partisan. It's not sweeping. It's common sense. It's about a single egregious case that happened because of egregiously bad judgment. The president and his aides set broad parameters, and apparently those parameters kicked back 1,500 cases. And they didn't even have the time and the decency to say, now let's look at these cases and see if each one of these people deserve a pardon. Maybe one was an elderly, nonviolent offender who had redeemed himself, whose victims had forgiven him. I could understand clemency in that case. Not the cash for kids judge. It's only 1,500 cases. They've got thousands of lawyers running around the Department of Justice. Could they not individually look at these cases? I guess not. It's just another example of how Democrats have spent 8 years of accusing Donald Trump of doing this, that, or the other dastardly thing, when in reality, they're doing much worse. We heard the senator from Illinois talking about a pardon for a political loyalist. Who could be more of a political loyalist than a president's own son? And that's what Joe Biden did. His first big post-election pardon his son, not just for specific crimes to which he had pleaded guilty or for which he had been convicted, gun crimes and tax crimes, but for all crimes that he committed or may have committed for 11 years. That's almost twice the length of the similar pardon that President Ford gave to President Nixon, which I think, though condemned at the time, most people would now view as an act of political courage. I don't think anyone in retrospect is going to think that Joe Biden pardoning his son for every crime he might have committed against the United States for 11 years is ever going to be seen as an act of political courage, or if he does the same thing for his brother or any other members of his family before noon on January 20th. So, starting next year, I really won't have time for crocodile tears about President Trump's pardon decisions if the Senate can't bring itself today to condemn just one single egregious case of abuse of the pardon power. The cash for kids judge who sentenced 2,300 children to private detention centers in return for cash kickbacks. Mr. President, I yield the floor.